Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Viking Age. Now, most historians agree that the Viking Age lasted from 793 AD up until the battle at Stamford Bridge in the year 1066. But there's a few years give and take as to when it actually started. Now, I was always intrigued greatly by Vikings, even from a young age. I read any book that I could get my hands on at a young age about them. But unfortunately, a lot of the only written sources that we have about the Vikings, the Norsemen, Scandinavians from that time, the only written sources we have from the time are, sadly, sources that were written by their enemies, namely Christians and, to some extent, Muslims. Now, of course, the Norsemen, they were able to write. They had their runic script, but they didn't really put pen to paper. Instead, they passed a lot of their stories down orally, and they would carve runes on stones, onto wood, etc. Now, the reasons that the Viking Age began, oftentimes we hear that, according to these mainstream historians and scholars, of course, they state that the Viking Age began due to overpopulation in Scandinavia, greed for shiny things. You can just look up any article on Wikipedia or pick up any history book, and it'll give you the reasons that I've just listed here. But honestly, I truly believe that the Viking Age began as a response to something that most historians overlook. And that is, I believe that the Viking Age was a response, an aggressive response, to the Christianization of Northern Europe in that time span. Now, Christianity, it started out, of course, in the Middle East. It managed to get a foothold into Rome in about the 3rd century AD. And from Rome, it expanded throughout Europe. And the last reaches to be, some of the last, the Scandinavian countries were not the last to be Christianized. That title goes to the Baltic states, that area of Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania. Those places resisted the Christianization up until, I believe, the 1200s. The Curonians or the Livonians, those tribes, they resisted pressure of accepting Christianity the longest. If you know anything about Europe, you will know that these areas are very remote. Now, I believe paganism, it survived throughout Europe, but only in the very rural areas. In cities, it was dominated by Christianity. Anyway, the Viking Age, the raids that were conducted by the Danes, the Norse, the Swedish, I believe that they were an offensive response to the Christianization of Europe. You have to go back, as I said earlier, from Rome, Christianity spread through Europe. The Goths, who are said to have come from the Jotaland, which is, if you don't know, it is an island off the coast of Sweden in the Baltic Sea, and it's where the Gothic tribes who eventually sacked Rome are said to have originated. Now, with the Gothic Wars and their incursions upon the Roman Empire, unfortunately they were eventually Christianized. I believe it was Alaric who had sacked Rome in, I'm not sure of the year, but it was in the 400s. Alaric was not a pagan. He was a Gothic Christian who had converted some time before he led the Gothic army to sack Rome. Anyone who had contact with Rome, the Gauls, the English, the British Isles, eventually anything that had contact with Rome, Christianity was spread. Now, you have to go back to the year 772, and this is when the Frankish, the Saxon Wars had started, and they were led. It was an aggressive expansion of the Carolingian Empire, which of course was led by Charlemagne. He's another one I'm not a fan of. He was a very brutal, domineering. He was horrible, and I will explain why. But you go back to the year 772, when the Saxon Wars started. It started because of missionaries coming into the Saxon realm, coming into Saxony, trying to convert the tribes there. Charlemagne, he tried to do this by force. In the year 772, he cut down the Airmen Sword, which I will cut to something. I will show you what the Airmen Sword is.
I imagine that this is what the Airmen Sword would look like, except it would be much larger, much taller. They said it was a hollowed out tree trunk, and I believe it was used during the festivities amongst the pagans. They would have their May King and May Queen rituals. So this is what the Airmen Sword was. It tied into the world tree, Yggdrasil. And of course, Charlemagne and his Christian Franks destroyed it in the year 772.
Now, in the year 772, Charlemagne, he cut down the Airmen Sword. Now the Saxon Wars, they went on from the year 772 to, I believe, about 804. I could be wrong there. But during this time, we hear the tale of Charlemagne, who lorded over the Carolingian Empire this entire time. We also hear of the Saxon hero Wittekind. Now, Wittekind had led the Saxon Wars. They lasted for years and years. You know, some years there wasn't much fighting, some years there was very intense fighting. Fast forward to the year 782. This is when Charlemagne led his campaign into Saxony and had defeated an army of Saxons at Verdun, and the massacre of Verdun, the blood court of Verdun. This is when Charlemagne had 4,500 Saxon warriors beheaded for refusing baptism, for refusing his Semitic desert religion. Now, I believe, of course, word traveled fairly quickly. Not as quick as today. You know, we have the internet and telephones and all that. But word spread fairly quickly. Now, Wittekind and the Saxons their neighbors to the north, the Danes, and also their neighbors to the west, the northwest, the Frisians. They were also pagan. I know for a period of time during the Saxon Wars, that Wittekind had been defeated and he fled into Nordmania, which was, of course, a name at the time. I believe it was a Frankish name for Denmark. Wittekind was friends with the Danish king Sigfrid. Now, he regrouped for a few years and then he stormed back onto the scene later on in the Saxon Wars. The Danes and the Frisians and the rest of Scandinavia, they were terribly alarmed at the ferocity that Charlemagne was leading against his own Germanic brethren for refusing to accept Christianity. Now, Europeans, especially the Germanic tribes, they practice their form of Germanic paganism, which extends to a broader sense. It is all European paganism. They're all interrelated. And it all goes on about reincarnation, veneration of your ancestors, several different aspects. Now, where was I? Anyway, I believe the Danes were alarmed. They seen the ferocity, the terrible actions committed by Charlemagne and the Frankish army. And I believe the Viking Age started as a response to this. They tried to head the storm off at the pass. They tried to seize the bull by the horns. Now, we all know that on June the 8th, 793, that is when a group of Danes sailed across the northern sea to Lindisfarne, the island monastery off the coast of Northumbria. There they massacred the monks at the monastery, they plundered the monastery, and they returned home. Now, of course, Christians will say that they were from hell and that they are just pure evil, just evil pagans. But let's go back to the Saxon Wars and possibly as to why the Norse, the Northmen, chose Lindisfarne as their first target. It's pretty easy, because during the Saxon Wars, Charlemagne was assisted greatly by Anglo-Saxon Christians, missionaries, who had traveled across the North Sea into Saxony to try to convert the pagans there. The Northmen seen that this is where the source of all this, that is trying to ruin our culture, trying to change our way of life that we have had for thousands of years, all the way back to our distant Neanderthal forebears. They seen this. So of course, at first, they decided to take out one of the sources, which was Lindisfarne. Now, there is some reports that a few years before the year 793 that some Danes or some Northmen, it doesn't specify which, but they had led a small raid into Francia. Now, in case you didn't know, the Franks and Charlemagne himself, they were a Germanic tribe. They were related to the Saxons, the Danes, any other Germanic tribe. Now, I think the Franks were Christianized sometime in the 5th or 6th century. And basically they are the ancestors of the modern French. The word France, Frank, very similar. Now, the Franks, they adopted a Latin language. I guess it would have been called Old French. It's a Latin language. It's connected to, Latin, of course. It's a Romance language. So Charlemagne, he was conducting all these terrible attacks and raids against his own Germanic kin. All for greed, basically. Now, you go forward a few years, we hear stories of Ragnar Sigursson, who is better known by his name from the sagas, Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, historians, they can't make up their mind as to whether he was just a legend or what. Myself, I believe that he was a real person. I believe he was a king of the Danes, and I believe his life was, it's hard to tell, but going from other sources, I believe he was probably born sometime in the 810 to 820, somewhere in there. I believe he was a real person because his sons, of course, who were Bjorn Ironside, Ubba, Halfdan, and Ivar. These are who led the Great Heathen Army into England in the year 865 that took over a large portion. I believe it took over Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. And they formed the Danelaw there in England. But anyway, these are all real people. It's confirmed. I'll show you a picture here. This is alleged to be Bjorn Ironside's grave mound in Sweden. Now, as I said earlier, most historians, they consider it, they're unsure if Ragnar was indeed real. I believe he was real because of the events that led to the Great Heathen Army. You can read Ragnar's saga if you want. It's very interesting. Now, if you go back to the year 845, 20 years earlier, before Ragnar's alleged death in the Great Heathen Army, if you go back, you will find that the Northmen had made it to Paris. They sailed up the river Seine and sacked Paris. Now, the leaders of the Franks at the time, it is recorded that they spoke often to the leader of the Northmen, and they referred to him as Reginarius, which is, of course, a Latinized version of the name Ragnar. So yeah, this is just a little bit about the early days of the Viking Age. I believe it was historians, of course, they will overlook the most. They look in too much into materialism a lot of times. They ignore the spiritual. And as to why the Northmen did what they did. They tried to prevent Christianity from changing their culture that they had had for thousands of years. I will speak more about this in the future. It's very hot out here today. Too much for my liking. So I will make a video later speaking more about this, about the later Viking Age. And a lot of these ideas that I speak of, they come from, of course, Varg and Vegard Solheim. I had found them a couple of years ago, and when I heard their views of it, it really just made a lot of sense. It makes a lot more sense than what these mainstream historians go on about. But yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Thank y'all for watching. Bye-bye.